Hello, everybody. Welcome to this installment of the Anti-Racist Capoeira Instruction Series. Today we have Instructor Embuia, who is from my school, from Jingarchi Capoeira under Mestre Marisa. And we also are so happy to introduce a new co-host. Cigarra, can you introduce yourself?
Hello, so my name is Cigarra. I train with Capoeira Malays in Toronto, in Canada. And I'm a student of Master Lewis.
Awesome. So Embuia, you are one of our instructors. You are my personal instructor, but you also surprisingly have a life outside of Capoeira. Can you tell me a little bit about the work that you do and your job and just the community engagement work that you've been working on for forever?
Sure. I am a community engagement manager with a nonprofit in Chicago that focuses on creating healthier environments in the school system. So a lot of my work is around engaging parents and community members about creating those healthy environments, where it'd be like nutrition education, making sure physical activity is taking place in the school, as well as like physical education. We believe in the common sense notion that healthy students are better learners. So we try to make sure that health is the lens with that everything is looked through in the school system.
Yeah, and then Cigarra, you have a background as well in organizing. Can you just kind of go through the bullet points of your political career?
Sure. So I am new in Capoeira. I have just this year would make about 4 years that I've been training in Capoeira. But prior to joining Capoeira, I was an organizer with the Black Lives Matter Toronto chapter, and that. Before that time, I was a student activist in the student movement at my university. So I have just over 10 years of that experience in organizing, and I'm still currently involved in labor work through my union. And that's kind of primarily my area at the moment. But I do have a variety of ways that I've been involved in community work.
Yeah, and so already we've talked more about politics, I think, than explicitly than any of the previous segments. So people might be wondering, why are we talking about politics when it's anti-racism? Cigarra, do you want to handle that one?
Yes, so some people will say we shouldn't talk about politics in Capoeira and that it creates divisions. Where do you think, Instructor Embuia, where do you think politics currently fit in or should fit in Capoeira?
Well, I think we have to understand the roots of Capoeira. Capoeira is a liberation movement, like that is its foundation. So I think in honoring the history of Capoeira, it demands that we do get involved in politics, and that is not to be confused with like party politics where you have to pick a certain side, but it's more about fighting for the rights of people that are being oppressed. And honestly, that shouldn't be a political issue. Like, we should all be taking care of the people that need to be taken care of in our society. But that is not everyone feels the same way about that. And that's when it becomes political. But I think Capoeira is a liberation movement, and it is our responsibility to uphold that fight.
I think that especially when we look at just how much of our lives directly correspond with legislation that passes, when we try to say like, well, Capoeira is apolitical, you wouldn't say the same thing about like defunding Black schools is apolitical. You wouldn't say the same thing about cutting or funding programs that disproportionately impact people of color. Like, when we actually say what politics is, I think it becomes very clear very quickly how politics and anti-racism are directly, inherently connected. But I think it can also get really overwhelming for people, especially when you're looking at electoral politics. Like, I know when I got my ballot, my ballot was like this long, and I had like 30 candidates to research in the last election that we voted in. So I guess, Embuia, what are some of the ways that you think individuals can most powerfully engage with the political process if they're new to all of this?
I think like it can be overwhelming, right? Like, but anything can be overwhelming when you first get into it. I mean, think about like capoeira. When you first start capoeira, you're gonna be like, oh my God, all these different moves, like all this different thing, all these like new things to learn. And it can be very, very, very overwhelming. But if you can just take it step by step, if one can just take it step by step and start small and make those little incremental changes, I think it is much more palatable. You can get like the bite size of it. So just focusing on like first like educating yourself on what exactly is going on in your neighborhood, in your community, knowing exactly how the political system works. Like in Chicago, we have like aldermen, like that is going to be the like the mayor of your individual neighborhood, and just knowing exactly what power they have, things that you can take to them, things that need to go to the city council. um, what is your district attorney doing, like things like that. I think if we can just like start on focusing on the people that are closest to us in power, and just start there, because a lot of times I know that I was the same way. Like the only time I really like voted was every 4 years for a presidential election, right? But honestly, like the presidents can handle like big ticket items, but your everyday life is affected by, you know what I'm saying, the judges that are like
Yeah.
that are in your system. You know what I'm saying? Like those are the people that we need to be more focused on. And you're not going to learn the entire system overnight. You're not going to learn about every candidate. If you just find resources that help you with your ballot, or like where you can put in the things that you most care about and see who aligns with that, and then just work on focusing on those people and following them for the most part.
Awesome. Quite literally, any successful political mobilization comes from getting people engaged and eventually getting larger community activated. When we look at moving a community, we're already at an advantage over a lot of spaces, because capoeira spaces tend to be more racially and socioeconomically diverse than the average group of friends in the same geographical location.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think are the strengths of the capoeira community, in particular when it comes to getting people voting or on board with a political campaign?
I think, yeah, exactly what you're just saying. Like when you look at capoeira, when I look around my hora at Jingarchi, we have people that do community work like myself. We have academics that are there. We have philosophy professors. We have lawyers. We have tradespeople that are like carpenters. So we have like all these different perspectives. Like we are a microcosm of what the nation is, right? So so even when it comes to like bouncing those ideas around, we can have those different perspectives represented, and then we can also like actually see what the consequences of certain actions would be, because we know what those effects are. It'd be one thing for me to be talking about, oh, this is what we need to do. I'm about the community, and these are what needs to pass like tomorrow. Then I can have my lawyer friend be like, well, actually, these are the steps that it's going to take. It's actually a bit more complicated than that. And I think the Capoeira Roda is going to be a great sounding board for any part of the movement. And that's an extreme advantage that we have. And we can also give each other tips on that mobilization. So I can be able to reach out to the community, because we're going to be working in different spheres. So if we do have, so if an action is developed that people want to take on, we already have that multifaceted approach built in, because we operate in different sectors. And I think that is a huge advantage that Capoeira gives a social justice movement, because it is not just like-minded people that operate in a very similar way. Like we can all go back out into our individual circles and make like a holistic kind of movement from there.
So I think that we have to very much acknowledge that the work that needs to be done politically is going to be split by race. And, this is where colorblindness kind of fails us, right? Because if you have somebody that's in an all-Black neighborhood that's been very active, going to their alderman, petitioning their mayor, but they've been silenced, they're not going to have the same political agency as somebody on the north side, which in Chicago means the white neighborhood, the white affluent neighborhood, that has, never politically mobilized, that doesn't know their alderman's name. you're going to have a very disparate experience. So when you look, especially in stratified areas like Chicago, where we're so separate, I want to like key into that. Like we said previously, we have this wide disbursement of careers, of neighborhoods. So when we have that diverse environment, how does that allow people to use their privilege specifically to help out with Black political organizing?
Yeah, like white privilege is a thing. Like we have to like acknowledge that, and we have to understand what opportunities that brings. Like we tend to think of it in a negative connotation, right? Like, oh, this person has this white privilege and we're mad about it. But there's also an opportunity for growth and advancement through that. Because I can go to a city council meeting and I can say anything, I can complain about what's going on in my neighborhood or certain legislation that needs to pass through the city council or whatever. But my voice, unfortunately, isn't going to carry as much weight, because if I'm coming from a lower income community that doesn't have the same, that doesn't generate the same like tax revenue, and we don't have the same political power, is going to be different from my North Side friends that are going to be coming to that same meeting and voicing their opinion, because they're also bringing that white privilege, and so they're going to be heard, and they represent more political power because they're going to be coming from a different neighborhood. So if my Lincoln Park friend, which is going to be an affluent white neighborhood in Chicago, if they're threatening to mobilize and get people together, it's going to be very different than me saying I'm going to be mobilizing people in South Shore. There's going to be a different sense of urgency that the powers that be are going to take that threat, for lack of a better term.
I want to cue in also, this is not like a hypothetical example. This is literally what's happening right now in Chicago. So for example, when we look at the movements, and lots of Capoeiristas have been cued into the current political moment, most people, I'm proud to say that most groups have taken a very strong stand on it. But when we look at steps forward, right, Black organizers have been pushing legislation for years, and they've just been unheard because of how structural racism works, how separate we are by neighborhood and community. But in Chicago, like we have specific legislation that this applies to, right? So there's something called CPAC, Community Policing Accountability Board, I think is the full name. And basically what it says is that we want an independent community review of the police. So if there is a shooting like we had of Rakia Boyd in Chicago, of Laquan McDonald, then there can be people who are not police that are involved in that process. And so with the CPAC in Chicago, as far as I understand, quite literally every Black and Latino alderman is on board. And the ones that are holding up in the political process are the rich white neighborhoods. And so like the current call to action, and one of the ways that we can have seen this play out, is that white allies have been called on in this moment to go to your alderman and say, approve this. And this is the first time, like, I feel, Embuia, do you know when CPAC was actually initiated? Because I feel like we've been pushing for it for like 7 years.
I do not know.
It's like the first time that we've ever seen it actually get traction on the North Side. And so this is the first time that I feel, because we have like the whole city engaged, right? That we're going to see anything actually happen. And I definitely want to say as well about weaponizing privilege, like from the perspective, of being a white woman and being in organizing spaces, we are very vocal about who do we send in when we're making the ask. Are we sending in the community organizer who's, a Black woman that's been working on this, that has been pegged as aggressive because of the racism in the political system? Right. Or do we send in, this random white woman who, a politician is going to react very, very differently to? Mm-hmm. And so, when we actually think about the mechanics of racism, I think it becomes very much easier to kind of see where we all fit in based on our privilege and based on our marginal identities. So
I think what you see there with like certain aldermen being for the community review board and some not, is going to be that disconnect between like what police actually mean to people, right? And I think that's where it's going to show up there, because generally speaking, of course, like a white man is not going to view the police the same way that I view the police, right? We do not have that same relationship.
Yeah.
So if I am calling for another system, another check, another balance to the power of police, it's going to sound irrelevant to someone who's going to be like, well, why would we need to do that? Like, this is a functioning body that is doing its job, which, another conversation for another day. It is absolutely doing its job. But the problem is its job is oppressing me. And what we need to do, we need to have a civilian review board, because the police cannot police themselves. There is an inherent conflict of interest there. Like, who do you call when the police murder? Like, and if you have that blue wall where people are going to be sticking together, because this is that fraternal way that they operate, like, we need to have someone that's going to be on the outside, that has some power, that is going to be able to review things. And then there's not, and there should be no fear of things being reviewed. Everyone gets reviewed at their job, right? Like, if you're doing a good job, then there shouldn't be anything that you have to worry about. The problem is that we know that a lot of people are doing very bad jobs at policing. And when I do a bad job at my job, no one dies. Like, no one is going to get killed because I didn't, like, fill out a spreadsheet correctly, right? But if a police officer does something and it goes wrong, someone has just lost their life. And we need to have somebody that is not a fellow police officer, that is not going to be in that system, that is going to be able to review that process.
No, I think that there's so many connections between the moments that we're having right now and the moments that have passed in previous civil rights movement. And we're seeing a whole new resurrection around mutual aid, which is pretty much just communities taking care of each other. And it is almost hopeful in a lot of ways, because neighbors are talking to each other that have never talked to each other before. Families are having conversations that they've never had to have before. And I think in a lot of ways, it is like really reminiscent of previous moments. Cigarra, you had something you wanted to ask about this one, right?
Yes. So before I get into that, actually, something Instructor Embuia said about the conflict of interest, it's so relevant to what's happening in Toronto. When we look at our version of CPAC, we have the Special Investigations Unit, which is the SIU, and it's supposed to function as a civilian independent review board. But over the years, it's sort of grown into a board that's made up of ex-police officers or retired cops, so we see that conflict of interest even when we try to make community spaces to review, these organizations and police services. Even with that, we come up with barriers to getting that review done. So I just had that comment, but just to go back to the question that I have for you, Instructor, it's just around during civil rights movements, when we look at how churches were used as a space or a hub for mobilizing community, it was effectively a political unit. So in some ways, Capoeira communities fulfill the same social need for that community space that churches have traditionally held. So my question is, what stands out to you when we look at Capoeira and the church in terms of organizing?
I think like going to what churches did, like churches had a like they serve that community role where it was the place where people were already coming to, right? Like that is a place that people were able to gather. They were able to celebrate their God, and they were able to like talk about the issues that directly reflected them. And it was also given that space, right? That was a space that other people weren't going to be intruding upon, right? So I think Capoeira serves in that way because this is a thing that we're already doing, right? And it also has like that built-in structure to it. And that's the thing about churches too, because you already have that built-in structure. So it'd be different from a community event or of any kind where you're going to have a lot of voices talking at the same time. Church had that. You had your podiums up there, like you have the culture of the system where you're used to like taking the voice, they're taking direction from something coming out, right? So you have the person speaking. Of course, people are going to be taking turns speaking, but you're used to like, okay, someone's speaking, we are paying attention at this time. So you have that built-in structure, and I think capoeira lends itself very well to that, just by the way that we give our attention to the bidinbao, like the person that's in the bateria that is speaking, our mestre that is going to be, whose voice is going to carry the loudest. And we have this structure of the hora where we're used to standing in a circle. And I think circles are very powerful, like it's a very powerful shape where you can, it's a built-in equality where there's no head. And with that, being in the capoeira circle, we know to respect each other's voices, and you can go around and you can share ideas and thought, and being able to wait your turn and giving everybody the opportunity to speak. It lends itself very well. The same way that churches were utilized during the civil rights movement, capoeira can be used now. And because we also have that built-in network across us, so it's not just being able to speak with people within my group. So I'm talking to like the carpenters and the lawyers and everybody else. But now we can have situations like this where like where we're talking to a capoeirista in Toronto. We can be talking to somebody in Ohio, where we have that built-in structure where we can mobilize in different cities and in different nations, and like fight for those same goals. And it's another way for us to communicate that isn't necessarily visible to, like, if we want to be low key, we can be low key when we need to be low key, right?
I think it's so interesting because one of the struggles that I've had in my role, so I'm with Social Practice Labs, which is a nonprofit in Chicago, and we've been doing a lot of community organizing, and it is so hard to organize people who don't know each other. It is so hard. I'm trying to like get people to talk to each other, and they're like, oh, can I just text them? Should I call them? But like, we already have people who know and generally like each other in the capoeira community. I just want to amplify like how much of a strength that is. When you're looking for some type of political movement, we have all the advantages already. We have a large group of people, a large enough group of people to show up to a town hall and be like, hey, I heard my school funding, my Embuia's school in his neighborhood is getting its funding cut. We're actually representatives of every neighborhood in Chicago. We're showing up with 20 people strong. We don't want this. And that's such a different impact than Embuia showing up on his own, And so it's like, I think of that. And I also think about the power of spaces in which people didn't necessarily come to that space directly for one person. So when we look at, all the research shows that we choose friends that are like us. That's just what we see. But you can have people that are within this circle, right? But they're at very different ends of spectrums. Like you can have somebody that's like very new to politics. You can have somebody that's literally dedicated their life and blood to this. You can have people who are janitors, and you can have people who are, like CEOs. And so I just want to like lean into like reiterate how powerful like that space is. Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
I agree. I think something that sparked. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Something that sparked an idea from what you said. I think a lot of my general philosophy is things that have to happen. We have to change the us versus them relationship. Like the problem is when we have these divisions, is because I define us as one thing and I find them as another. So I can be like, okay, the us for me may be like Black people, them white people, right? And then it's not until there's like an alien invasion that we're gonna be like us human beings, them aliens, and that's the way we tend to like bond. It's like it's always an us versus them. And what we have to realize, like particularly in Chicago, is if there is a school closing on the south side of Chicago, that does affect all of us as a city. So it can't be like, oh, that's happening on the south side. This is happening. This is a north side issue. That's a west side issue. Like, no, this is a Chicago issue. And if it's a Chicago issue, then it's a state issue. And if it's a state issue, then it's a national issue.
Yeah.
And really, we really have to start thinking about ourselves in a global way, because the things that we're doing to help or not help people is going to affect everyone in some way or another, if not today, but in the future. And that's the way we need to think. We just need to broaden our horizon on what us really means.
It's almost like if you had a Hoda and you had like a few people that are like standing out and like looking the wrong way and like texting on their phones. It's like, no, we need all y'all to get in here if we're gonna have any semblance of success, you know?
Exactly.
So I want to talk directly about strategy, and I want to frame everything within the context of capoeira, because I think that that's where our power lies in this community. But like for people like us, we've been doing this for a while. And it can be like pretty straightforward to think of, oh, we want to do this and we want to do this and we want to do that. And it's just not like that for a lot of people who have been either alienated from the political process or have just never had issues hit them directly enough to engage. So I wanted to talk about tools. I wanted to give folks that are watching this some concrete tools that they might consider implementing in their own schools. And so like, I wanted to do a few rounds of this, but my favorite that I'm very excited to talk about, I like ballot parties. And I think that those fit like really well with capoeira structure. So ballot parties is basically when you have a big gathering and everybody comes over and they have their ballot, they have all these candidates, and you guys just work together. You put on some music, you get some food, and you just work together to go through all of these candidates. And it's like, it's really funny because like you'll have everybody researching and they'll be like, I like this judge. And then the person in the corner will be like, they disproportionately sentence Black men to you know, prison sentences. And then like, you'll have this one like, I like this person, they're an environmentalist. And then you'll have somebody be like, I just found this article, they kicked a puppy. And it's just like, you know, it's just like this thing of like this very communal, like we don't have to do this all on our own. These ballots are exhausting to go through and research and become educated on every candidate. And at least in my experience, everybody brings something different. So like, I don't know if it's national or just Chicago, but there's like Injustice Watch. And then in Chicago, we have the Girl, I Guess, Progressive Voter Guide, which is actually made by some of my friends. And so it's like everybody brings evidence and you use that community strength. I'm thinking about like if we did like a ballot party and then like a music night or a holiday after, like it's very easy to integrate. We already get together. We already hang out in unstructured ways. And again, we already genuinely like each other. So like that's mine. But like what comes to mind? We can just bounce off each other. So who wants to go first?
I can go first.
Yeah.
I love this question around grassroots organizing, and when we think of tools for successful organizing in spaces, because it relates so much to capoeira in that, you know, the main tool that I can think of is just, you know, skill sharing and the skills that we have as individuals to give back to our community. When we think of capoeira is all about skill sharing. It's all about passing the torch and empowering others to grow and develop so that they feel comfortable to lead the work as well. You know, you're working your way up to sort of take the gunga in the roda. So I always think of this Tupac quote. It must have been from like 1993, 94, where he talked about that he might not be the person to change the world, but he will spark the brain that does change the world. And my favorite part is actually the end of the interview, which he says after that, it's our job to spark somebody else that's watching us. And so we might not be the ones, but we shouldn't be selfish and not talk about how we should change the world. So for me, that connects with skill sharing. You know, it may not be me to lead the movement, but that doesn't mean that I shouldn't help someone that is coming up after me, that's coming into their awareness, and share the skills that I have through what I had been through. So for me, skill sharing is a big one in terms of grassroots organizing and the tools that we use, just teach-ins, educationals, I think it's so important. Not everyone has access to the same resources. When we think of folks that have degrees, folks that, didn't go to university, so you have access to that. So I think that's something definitely that grassroots organizing can sort of take an example from Capoeira in terms of that culture of sharing.
Yeah, I'm just like, as you were talking, I was thinking about all the things that are already happening in Chicago. Like in our group, we have a legal observer. And so legal observers are folks that go to protests and they create an accurate log of what happened, so that if somebody does end up in court, they have solid evidence to defend them and to avoid getting an erroneous sentence. But I'm also thinking of like medics training, like basic first aid. People forget, people get hurt, like, and when we talk about like larger goals, right? Learning about transformative justice, learning how to handle harm that was done within the community that we may not want to put through official structures because of the further harm that it can do to the community if we involve folks in that. I know a lot of people that are really learning about that right now, and as well as teaching. I'm thinking also of just like leaning in, like our mesher is amazing. Like when you look at how she takes care of events, she is just like making sure, is everybody fed? Is everybody taken care of? Is everybody comfortable? Is everybody, And so it creates like an opportunity for us as her students to think about, and this goes into a way I think about how women are often not celebrated in Capoeira as much as they should. But that event didn't go just be in the hora. Like if all of that planning didn't happen before to get that event there, then it would not have happened. That hora would not have occurred if it weren't for the planners and the nurturers and the caregivers and the schedulers and the drivers and all of these people. And that's the exact same thing. That's the exact same thing that happens with a protest, with a movement. Like you need somebody that's gonna bring the snacks if you're gonna have a meeting for longer than an hour, And yeah, I'm really happy you brought up that example.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to think about like the mentality that goes into like to social justice and like the way our society I think should function. Like the first question is, are people's basic needs being met?
Yeah.
Like you want to have this like you're in Capoeira, like you want to have this amazing hora, right? You want to have people doing backflips, you want the music to be strong, but people need to be nourished and hydrated, right? Like, and that's what we need. You want a strong, thriving city? Well, people need proper nutrition. People need access to healthcare. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, if you fulfill like these basic needs, then you're going to have people that are going to be thriving in the educational academic system. You're going to have these people that are going to be like providing so much more to society. Like, how much genius are we missing out on because we don't water those seeds? You know what I mean? So yeah.
Well, that's like when you look at folks that are mobilizing against progress, that's one of the things that you see is if you can interrupt. This is where you see people smashing the medic stations at protests, right? This is where you see people letting off fireworks in neighborhoods to keep people afraid and not sleeping so that they can like stoke intercommunal tensions. Like it's all people who mobilize against and for oppression. Sorry, people who mobilize for oppression, they know these things. And I think that sometimes we forget them, but it's so true. It's like you have to meet your basic needs before you try to do anything or get anybody anywhere,
I think another thing that Capoeira really brings to the table, and I got another, going back to the question about tools, relationship building. In any movement, you gotta like build relationships between people. If you're doing anything, if you're working in an office, I believe you need to have like some relationship building. Like you can't move together as a unit if you don't know who you're moving with. And with Chicago being such a segregated city, there are going to be issues that I'm going to be experiencing on the South Side that other members in Jingarchi, our Capoeira group, may not know anything about, may not have access to. There can be full demographics of people that we may not interact with much, like outside of Capoeira. Like if you live in Edgewater, the far north side community, you may not come down to South Shore for anything. You know what I'm saying? Like there's nothing that's gonna bring you down here except me. Like I might have a, you know what I'm saying, a music night. Like, hey, why don't everybody come to my house? So therefore you can actually like see firsthand what's going on in different neighborhoods, without having to rely on the media, where you can actually like see the consequences of like certain actions that are being taken, be able to hear the authentic stories from people that are actually living in those situations. So you can see like, oh, actually things are not as bad that the media kind of portrays things to be, right?
Yeah.
Talking about trying to lower property values as a spearhead for gentrification. And then, but then you can also see like, oh, there's beauty in these neighborhoods. And then you can see like, oh, this actual thing is actually really bad that no one is talking about. We need to get together and really focus on this. Like, wait, how many schools closed? Where were the schools? All here. So now these kids have to go how far? Because
Yeah.
it say that this kid that now has to go a mile west. A mile is different to everybody depending on where that mile is. So like a mile to me as an adult is going to be very different than a mile of a 13-year-old that also has to think about these borders that I don't see when you're talking about like gang lines and stuff like that. So that mile means nothing to me. That mile means that is 2 states over for somebody that may be like 13 years old.
I want to specifically clarify that for folks that may not be in Chicago. We actually had a few years ago, oh wow, God, it's almost like 8 years ago now. But there were 54 Black and brown schools closed, and there was one majority white school. But don't worry, guys, our mayor opened up a high school in a white neighborhood named after Obama, so it was okay. But no, like, you know, when you would see the news, you would see the news and it would be like, oh, you know, don't worry, the kids get to go to a better school. But because, you know, living on the South Side and having relationships across the city, you know, you would hear from the kids and they'd be like, I was on a bus for 3 hours today, you know, and those are the connections. I mean, even when we look at how we travel for events, my main news sources from a lot of what's happening in Minneapolis, in Houston, in all of these cities where there's like really intense protesting, is coming from the folks on the ground. And how do I know them? I know them through Capoeira, you know? And
right.
So I think also we have that strength, right, of like our mobility. Like we go to events, we stay in people's homes. We're not staying in hotels, most of us, although some of us get Airbnbs now because our backs and knees are bad. But we're in the communities, like we're with the folks that live there and we're seeing what they see every day. And that's a huge like tool against like media narratives that, like you said, are trying to push gentrification or just trying to get, maybe if it's not so nefarious, maybe they're just trying to get views, you know?
Right.
But there, as Cigarra, I feel like we've just talked a lot about Chicago. Do you want to bring in anything from Toronto specifically? Because I know that you have a very different experience than we do stateside.
I'm just trying to think of sort of what's been said, like regarding schools in Toronto. I know that just the ongoing fight to keep cops out of schools, which is there was a 6-year-old in Peel region that was handcuffed, and that's like a really pressing issue in terms of our geographical location when it comes to safety of school children. So it's been an ongoing battle, you know, for parents to sort of appeal to like our city council to just ensure that, you know, this program does not get implemented. So, you know, we have different sort of issues, but I think overall the structural issues are very similar in terms of what, you know, is you're going through. So even though we're in a different country, like the relationship to Black folks and policing still looks the same. So you know, yeah, I don't have too much to add on that, but yeah, I can just sort of speak to that. And then it's obviously different if you are a Black person. In Capoeira, you come to class and, you know, we like to leave our baggage at the door so that we can have a clear head to train, but, you know, not everyone is afforded that as well. So everybody has different issues that they come with. And for me, you know, I'm not a parent myself, but I do have 2 Black little nephews in school here. So that's something that I worry about, when they're constantly, at fault in school for the fights that they get into. I have to wonder if there's implicit bias that the teacher is imposing on them. And so, it's we do what we can to protect ourselves, but it's a collective issue. So we should all be taking care of each other. And Capoeira is the first time I've ever pretty much felt that sense of belonging, and like that my presence matters in a community. So I sort of wish that I could see more of that when we look at the way folks vote, for instance, and the representation of our, political ministers and so on that make decisions on our behalf. It's very, very rare that we're represented in around those tables. So that's, I think pretty much what I can add to just to tie in what you folks have already said. I think what you said has been really awesome.
It's always so apparent to me when, sorry, let me say this without actually calling people out that'll get me in trouble. But it's always so interesting to me when you can see that there's such a clear disconnect between communities and between Black and white folks and other people that are non-Black in power, because there's a lot of websites in particular institutions that I may or may not be a part of that have suddenly put up Black Lives Matters on like everything on the website. But it's like, well, people were actually asking for a decommitting resources to, police and actually getting programs for, I don't know, Black students of a certain level of education that is not my college. Oh man. But like, that's what I'm saying. Like you get this like symbolic representation versus like accepting people's message in its wholeness. Whereas and really absorbing what it is that people want. And Contra Misha Versachio has a quote that I love. It's like, we don't say leave your baggage at the door. We say bring it in so we can unpack it together, And there's this beautiful acknowledgement of eeach other's humanity in that, to be like, no, I see not just you, but all of you. And I want to know all of you, and I want to understand all of you. And we have so few spaces where that's like a real thing that can happen. I'm also thinking about like what leadership looks like, right? When you're in these spaces, like we talk about what it is to advance in Capoeira, but a lot of groups, Cigarra, do you remember the elder's name on the call yesterday, the panel?
Master Temba.
I think it was Baba
Temba.
Yeah. Like he was talking about how we like capoeiristas can show up in, capoeiristas can show up in spaces like, oh, we heard that this was happening. I'm showing up as a community member, but I'm also a capoeirista. And so I think about that a lot, right? Because that's him showing leadership as a human, not just as in the roda, not just in the classroom, but in general across the span. And people see that, right? And they engage with it. And so like, I think about, it's actually pretty easy to get registered as a registrar to be able to personally register folks to vote. It's not that hard. What if we had that as a requirement for advancing, I've tried to go through the process. I'm trying to go through the process now. It's not that much. And I'm thinking about, what if instructors were keeping an eye on what's happening, and they're like, oh, this arts program is getting defunded. We need to show up as a group. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that had me thinking a little bit while you're talking. I think another thing that we as quote unquote leaders in Capoeira and like in our personal lives, the things that we have to bring to the table is like the understanding that people are going to be in different positions, and our expectations need to be different from everyone. Everyone has their own lane in the movement. Like we're all traveling on the same road, but everyone can travel in a different lane. Like I want to be out on the front lines at protests. Like that's who I am. But if someone doesn't want to do that for whatever reason, like you can contribute to the movement in a different way. You can be on the police scanners. You can be like, you can be the person on the sideline giving out the water. You can be the person that's like giving people rides once they get arrested. You know what I'm saying? Like, so we all have our different levels of engagement. And I think we naturally learn that when we're in Capoeira as well. Like the same expectations you have for someone that is very new to capoeira, like just thinking about like the movements and songs and stuff like that, you're going to have a different expectation for somebody that has much more experience or has a different level of dedication. So I think like leaving room for people to operate the way that they want to operate is also very important.
And with that, I'm just thinking also of how important it is to let folks know that they're valued for their work and the energy that they bring to the table, regardless of what space it is, you know, how the organizing takes place. As you mentioned, they could be giving out water. You know, everyone's role is important, and we are, you know, because of each other. That's something that my mestre says. One of the mestres in my group says that often, and I think, you know, that's something that's really key in terms of a movement surviving and being successful. Because we do need each other. You know, you need people to have the order, you need people to clap, you need people to sing the response. The same way, you know, when you're organizing, you need everyone to feel valued and that their presence matters, because it has to, and it does, because we need each other in order to grow and achieve the collective goals for all of our benefits. So that's a pretty good point that you raised, Embuia. Thank you.
That's a lovely note to naturally end on. We're coming to the end of our time. So usually this is where I would have the speaker plug the work that they're going on, but I'm from the same group. So we have online classes. Come hang out with us. When we eventually start doing things in the real world again, please come to our events. We would love to see you. I also wanted to encourage people, if you like this series, please share it into spaces that I might not necessarily be connected with. Embuia, Cigarra might not necessarily be connected with, because we really do want folks to see this. We want this to be a tool, I've said tool so many times, that people can use when they're trying to bridge this like outrage that we're having about the things that are happening in this moment into concrete action. So that's the intent of this series, is to amplify and archive the work that's already being done. We have a GoFundMe going. We have about 12 speakers on the docket right now. We'd love to do more. We have a YouTube channel as well that was created by Agua Viva from Candes, and I really, really appreciate it. It's so nice. It's got a nice little banner. So please follow the YouTube channel, donate to the GoFundMe if you can, share it to all your friends, and then tell them to share it to their friends. We really appreciate it. Thank you guys so much for being here, and thank you for bridging these things, because it can be really hard to like take the things that exist in this sphere of your life and in this sphere of your life and figure out how they fit together. But that's what people are doing right now. Does anybody have anything that they want to say before we close out?
I just wanted to thank both of you for having me on this platform and giving me a platform to speak on like my beliefs and my thoughts. It is very important that as many ideas are brought to the table as possible, and we're hearing from everyone. So I thank you very much for allowing me to share, and also with sharing with me. And I look forward to working and getting to know you each more. So thank you.
And shout out to our Mestre Marisa as well, for creating the space in which all of this has happened in the first place. So we'll see you guys on hopefully the future installments of this. Take care, stay safe, and yeah, let's get to work.